So, Matt, everyone is talking about mental health at the moment. We're obsessed with mental health, but what really is mental health? How do we define that?
It's a really good question. And that's an active part of our research, is getting to the bottom of what do we actually mean by mental health. Because at the moment, so often when you see mental health, it's really the mental illness that people are talking about. So for a long time, there's been this assumption that you say mental health, you mean mental illness. As a result, that's meant that we've kind of overlooked the positive sides of our mental health. What does it actually mean to live a good life? And there's been this, emerging field in the last 20 years or more, based on obviously years and years of research and even like, ancient Greek philosophy and stuff like that, asking what does it mean to live a good life? And so that's become quite formalized now and sort of empirical, as people have been collecting data around, how do we measure well-being, how do we define it, and how do we improve it?
So, are there different definitions according to whatever school of
Absolutely.
study?
Yeah. Well, there are lots of issues. I don't know if you've met how many academics you've met. A lot, probably. Yeah. They don't often agree. They often assume that their approach is the right one and the only one. And so what that's meant is that over the years, people have come up with different models of what they mean by well-being. I mean, we don't even agree on what we should call it. Should it be well-being? Well-being without a hyphen? Wellness, positive mental health, mental well-being. So I generally mean by mental well-being as kind of, these are all synonyms of each other. But there are different philosophies of what do we actually mean by mental well-being, and then the different disciplines that are involved in this work measure what they mean by well-being differently as well. So if you were in a physical health, like a medical environment, often when they're talking about well-being, they're talking about quality of life, which is about sort of the extent to which you're functioning well. Are you able to do the things you want to do in the day? If it's more from a philosophical background, obviously there's different philosophies around what does it mean to live a good life, whether it be more hedonic, meaning about like the good, the enjoyment of life, or eudaimonic, which is more about virtue and character development and functioning as you would like to function. So it gets pretty messy
Yeah, because it seems quite subjective, right? Because my idea of a good life could be different to someone else's. Like, for example, there are people who are by all accounts successful and rich and live a incredible lifestyle, and they travel and they have beautiful clothes, but they're not happy. Whereas I've actually heard that the Worldwide Happiness Index, or whatever, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, often it's countries that are less developed where people have less money, I've heard, are happier people. Do you have any comments on?
Yeah, look, again, it comes down to what it is that you're actually measuring. And when you say, this is where it gets complicated, I think, because when you say, what is a good life, you're having to define what is good.
Yeah,
Right.
complicated.
So if you set your standard on what is good as being like material wealth, well, then that's a totally different outlook on what happiness is compared to setting it to things like having warm and trusting relationships, having a sense of autonomy in life, having a sense of direction and purpose, these sorts of things. So it's pretty different. Sometimes they often overlap, and there's an entire field, someone that I'm about to speak to on my podcast, about this idea of the Easterlin Paradox. Have you heard of that?
No, Easterlin.
Yeah. So named after someone who just passed away, who's a giant in this field, who basically, there's this kind of paradox about this idea that as, I guess, average income goes up in a country, they tend to get happier until a certain point. And so, what's the story there is kind of the idea of the paradox. But
so Be Well Co. is the company you work at. You've just done some really interesting research on languishing. Just the name alone is interesting. It's not a word that we use all the time, languishing. So could you tell us a little bit about what languishing is and what
I'll walk you through it. So this is a team. The issue with, as we've said, mental health is that it's defined so poorly, basically. And it's a personal frustration for me that you walk down the shops at the supermarket and you'll see like well-being is written on tissue boxes and it's on yogurt, and it's like, take this supplement and increase your well-being. That's only $12.99 or something. So where's my money best spent for my well-being, right? I think that starts with the academic world, because we are not agreeing amongst ourselves of what do we actually mean by well-being. So anyone can pick up this language and just use it as ever they like. And so we set out on a series of projects basically to get to the bottom of, can we reach consensus by what we mean by well-being? And so we pulled this team of academics together. So they're academics from around the world, a few from Australia and a few from the US, and Dorota, who's at Harvard, but I think she lives in Poland at the moment, or she's gone back home. But a really great team of people who have different perspectives on what we mean by well-being. So we have clinical psychologists, we have economists, we have sort of sociologists, public health, and we have sort of measurement economics as well. So lots of different perspectives, because they're all answering these things different ways, right? What we did for our first study was just to review what's out there in terms of well-being measurement. And so what we did was, based on kind of the way that the WHO defines mental well-being, is very what they call multidimensional. So they talk about a state of well-being where you have this and this and this and this, and really picks up on lots of the things from the well-being space, but also from quality of life, like I said before, and these ideas of like resilience and coping. So being able to manage the adversity that you face. And so we did this very broad review of what are the measures coming from the sort of the well-being literature, the resilience literature, and the quality of life literature, to really see what are they including in their measures. And long story short, we found 155 different measures. So these are survey tools that are out there, which already is like just too many, because, how do you choose which one would be appropriate? But more to the point, the problem was that of those 155 measures, they said they were measuring 400 different things.
Right.
So, is it truly the case that there's 400 different things we need to be working on for our well-being? Hopefully not. And so what we did is we got to the bottom of sort of synthesizing what were these things actually. So some would talk about energy levels, others would talk about vitality. If you look at how they measured them, they're basically the same concept, right? So we're able to then reduce that down to this set of 21 that you see on the slide. And we sort of map them back against where they came from. And so what this diagram sort of demonstrates is that something like meaning and purpose was very commonly, basically equally as commonly occurring in the wellbeing literature as it was in the quality of life and the resilience and coping. So the things that are in the middle were very consistently measured. So things like happiness, so like really just about positive emotion, autonomy, optimism, a sense of community, meaning and purpose, self-acceptance, they were very, very commonly coming up across all three of those fields. But then each field kind of introduced other things that are quite unique to them. So for example, quality of life paid a lot of attention to physical health and personal circumstances. Resilience and coping really brought in this idea of calmness, but also the more coping styles like avoidance-focused coping and emotion and problem-focused coping. And so the idea is that this was a starting place for us to say, here's kind of everything that's been done. It's not for us as a team to say what's in or out, but at least it's a map of what's out there. Where that took us was to this next study. We did what's called a Delphi study. And a Delphi is where you pull together a panel of experts and you invite them to vote on a particular topic. And what you're trying to reach is what's called academic consensus. So we use what we found in that first study and a second study, which is too much detail, but we use that to present to them, here's all these dimensions of positive mental health that we've found. Do you think that they're essential, important, peripheral, or irrelevant to the idea of positive mental health? And we invited 150 experts from these 11 fields that you see, which is huge. Like as far as a Delphi study, that's quite large.
Yeah.
And basically the way
People from across the world, experts from
across the world, and you can see the countries
wow.
from there. But most importantly, from these different disciplines. There are so many disciplines that have some say in, positive mental health. And probably there's even more, right? But these were the most common ones. And basically what we said was, we will invite the top 150 most cited authors or academics from these different fields. And so as you can see, this is just the results of sort of who rocked up, but we did have representation from across the board, which was great. The years that they'd been working in the space. So most of them have been working in the space for sort of more than 10 years, somewhere between 10 and 40 years was kind of the
Wow.
the
Yeah,
large
very
body of them. So it's a really
experienced.
experienced group, and the average citation count, academics have all these different KPIs. I don't know if you're about citations and stuff, but the idea is that the more you're cited, basically the more you're cited, the more you're trusted. Yeah, work is considered important in the field. It's a very crude measure, but the idea is that on average, the participants, there was about 120 participants in this study. Their average citation count was 12,000 citations,
Wow.
which is quite an experienced group
Yeah.
of people. So basically what happens is it goes over 3 rounds where you invite them to, you say like, here's the 26 dimensions that we found. Crudely, are they in or out? And the idea is that there's a cutoff. If 75% agree, then it's straight in. If there's anything less than that, we go to the second round and say, let's just double check it basically. What did we see? So over those 3 rounds, and they also had the opportunity to suggest other things that we may not have come across. And we basically ended up with this set of 19 dimensions.
Wow.
And so it's similar-ish to where we started, but some pretty key differences. And what we've done is we've clustered this into sort of these 4 themes, things that are related to your life, because broadly we're saying to feel well, you want to be sort of satisfied with your life, how your life is going. You want to be satisfied with yourself and content with yourself, who you are. You want to be
Similar but different.
but different. Yeah, absolutely. You want to be feeling good, and functioning well.
Yeah. Which are also similar, aren't they? Yeah.
They're all
But
very similar.
feeling good might be more, as it says here, like happiness, vitality, calmness, functioning well. I would have read that more as a physical functioning. But
Oh
here
yeah, it's very much about the way you're
Mental health,
functioning
yeah.
in a mental capacity. So wanting to feel engaged with your life,
Yeah.
to feel competent, which is that you can achieve the goals that you set out to do.
Yeah.
That you have a sense of meaning and purpose, that you have warm and trusting relationships, these sorts of things. And so what we're trying to do here is to get some agreement on what are the puzzle pieces. Because the idea is that obviously you don't have to say I'm 10 out of 10 on all of these things to feel well. In my personal opinion, this is where your first comment comes in, which is around an individual's value system comes in, because you may value some of these things more than others. And in my opinion, I think you would feel well when the things that you care about, when you're satisfied with the things that you care about.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So
Judging by your own standard.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's kind of hopefully the next direction for us. And so we were really fortunate. This was funded by the Department of Health Victoria. And this is something that will inform a lot of their policy going forwards, because they're really focused as a state on promoting the mental well-being of their people, which is enviable, basically, I guess, for lots of other states around the country and the world. And so the idea that this would be at least a clearer roadmap, I think, is really exciting.
Pulling on that thread a little bit, why do you think it is important for states or governments to care how we're feeling?
Well, that takes us straight to the languishing question. But this idea that having low levels of well-being, so having low levels of these dimensions that you see here, comes with really significant costs, basically. So, and those costs are not necessarily the same as mental illness rate in a population. So we can go there now. Actually, it's a perfect
Great. Because I think we can all understand why society would be concerned about rates of like schizophrenia, for example, or depression, or anger issues, or other issues like this. But I think a lot of people out there might be wondering, like, why would I care if, the guy down the road from me who I don't know is feeling a little bit meh about his life?
Sure. Yeah. Well, the well-being is an interesting one, I think, because it comes with costs if you don't have it, but it's also a valuable thing in its own right. To feel good, to feel well, to feel like, you have a sense of optimism and life satisfaction, all these things that you see on the screen, they're valuable in their own right, and so we should want to have citizens who feel this way. The other side of that is the costs that come with it. So people with low well-being, they are at risk of future mental illness. They're at greater risk of physical illness. They use health services more often. They are less productive at work. There's a whole world of the costs that come from this stuff. And so it's kind of depends on what's the most compelling argument based. So the other thing we got the Delphi panel to do was we presented them a definition that we'd been working on along with Beyond Blue in Australia. And again, this came from a big review of how people were defining mental well-being. And actually, we got them to vote on what should we even call this thing, positive mental health, wellness, blah, blah, blah. They voted positive mental health. So this is how we defined it. Positive mental health is a personal and subjective experience where we are content with our lives, we feel good, function well, and view ourselves favorably. Our level of positive mental health may vary over time and is influenced by the way we adapt to the problems and opportunities that we face. It's impacted by many factors such as our environment, life experiences, cultural background, biology, and behaviors. Many people have some level of positive mental health, and we can improve it by taking action using a variety of means, even when we experience a mental health condition.
Pretty concise. Yeah.
Thank you. You have to be pretty brave, I think, to give 100 experts a definition and say, what do you think?
Yeah.
Because they let you know what you think. They let you know what they think. And it's improved drastically because of that. So that was a really great thing. When we talk languishing, we're talking about this feeling of blah, basically. It's this feeling, that's how it was described very popularly by Adam Grant.
Okay.
Who wrote an article in the New York Times. It was actually the most read article of 2021.
Wow.
And if you think there was a lot to write about in 2020.
Exactly. A lot of languishing happening.
A lot of languishers. So he described it as a feeling of blah. And I think people really resonated with that idea, that particularly those who were in lockdowns or really weren't able to live the life that they would have liked to or were planning, they did feel this issue. And so taking a step back, we talk about languishing as having a low level of well-being without being diagnosed with a mental illness. So it's this kind of middle ground between feeling well and, being ill, basically, having a mental illness. And it is basically having low levels of all those dimensions that we spoke about. Our big mission, I guess, is to shine the light on this issue of languishing, because it comes with so many costs, like we said, but also because people who are languishing just fly under the radar. We're just really not noticing this group of people. And I think it's still an open question, but people can languish for a long time, before they show up anywhere. And so from a proactive perspective, that's a huge opportunity for us to be reducing future costs, reducing future mental illness, but also helping, in this case, Australians to live their best life.
Yeah. And I think it's very in line with Quillette's values, and everyone who works at Quillette and people who read Quillette. We're people who are about human flourishing. And at least speaking personally, I think if people, or if I can feel better or do better, why not attempt to do that? Why not attempt to self-improve and improve people are feeling?
And there's an ongoing discussion about where should that improvement come from? Is it up to the individual? Is it up to, or is it on the environment that we're in? And I think the answer is both.
Yeah.
Again, academics will disagree on all of this stuff, but basically
that's interesting.
This thing here.
Yeah, we need to reframe the way we think about mental health. There is no mental health spectrum.
Yeah, so this is the topic that I did my whole PhD on, basically, as we get into it. So this has been the sort of the prevailing mentality, basically, of mental health promotion, which is that if we looked at this spectrum from mental disorder through languishing up to flourishing, which is high well-being, the idea is that, and this comes from Felicia Huppert, who was, again, a very, very respected person who also passed away just this year. She was in Sydney. If we had this normal curve of, how is a population distributed in terms of their sort of their well-being or their overall mental health, if we could shift that population curve a few points to the right here towards flourishing, we'd find less people in the mental disorder. And so this has been the way that's kind of characterized the way that we think about mental health promotion. And we sort of think, roughly there's 20% of people in that kind of clinical space and the rest are in the non-clinical space. So the 20% is for the clinicians to be focusing on, and the rest is kind of for like wellbeing professionals, community to be working on. But the issue with this, and why we need to reframe the way we think about it, is that this has this inherent assumption that mental illness is, at the end of mental health on the same spectrum, that these things, a person basically can be anywhere from -10 all the way through to +10.
Are you sort of saying as well from that you can be mentally ill but still have a good sense of well-being?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Interesting.
And so that's where this dual-continua model comes from. And this is someone that my PhD is based on, Professor Corey Keyes. He was actually the person who coined the term languishing, and the Adam Grant article was about him and his work. He talked about this idea of this dual-continua approach to mental health. So rather than thinking of mental illness and mental well-being as this single, like the opposite ends of the same spectrum, that we should actually think of them as two separate continua, which is kind of how we describe it here. So you can be anywhere from high or low levels of well-being, high or low degree of severity of mental illness. And what this means is that, very crudely again, you could fall into any of these quadrants where you have high levels of well-being with a mental illness, all the way through to low levels of well-being, no mental illness, which would be the languishers. And the issue, in my opinion, and there's a lot of evidence to support the dual-continua model, is that primarily this group of people who have high levels of well-being with a mental illness, they exist in the population. When we go out and measure mental health in workplaces, we see anywhere between 5 and 10% of a workplace sitting in that category. But they shouldn't exist in that previous model, because how can you be at two places at once on the single continuum? Right? And this aligns really closely to lived experience and what they call personal models of recovery.
What is lived experience? Because that term triggers me.
Okay, yeah, no,
Sure,
yeah, and it can be misused like any term.
Yeah.
I'm here talking about, like, when you listen to the experience of those with a mental illness, they'll often sound much more like they're talking about the dual-continua way of viewing the world than the single continuum. There's this idea of personal versus clinical recovery. So clinical recovery is when, you're told you have a mental illness by a clinician, and then at a certain point, you're told you don't have that anymore, you have recovered. That's clinical recovery. Personal recovery, particularly in the context of a chronic mental illness or a recurrent mental illness, is where you, the user, or the individual, the service user, but the individual defines what recovery looks like to you. And so they talk about lots of well-being related things. They talk about connection, hope, identity, meaning, and empowerment. That's called the CHIME model.
Okay. Is addiction classed as a mental illness?
It's often in there. Yeah, I'm not really talking about addiction so much.
Yeah.
Because I think that is something separate for the purposes of what we're talking about, but it often is included in mental illnesses.
Yeah.
On that group of people who can experience high levels of well-being despite mental illness, I think that's being contested in the literature, basically. So people are finding, particularly for depression, I think is where it looks the most what they call bipolar. Like you're either, it is a single continuum where you would range from mental illness through to happiness, sort of thing. And a lot of people say, well, I have a hard time understanding how could someone in a deep depression feel well. And the idea for us, I guess, in the context of this, is that we're not saying, someone with a diagnosed mental illness would feel well at all times, right? So it comes down to what's the sort of the clinically relevant time frame to think about. So if we're saying, like, in the moment, like right now, if you're in the midst of a depressive bout, do you feel like you have a lot of direction in life? Probably not. But over a week, might you have moments where you actually feel that you do? Over 2 weeks? I think the answer is yes.
It's interesting too, because isn't it sort of a symptom or part of being depressed, maybe not clinical depression, but at least pop understanding of depression, that you might actually spend more time happy than you think you do? It's just because of your cynicism or depression or whatever, you actually don't even notice those happy times, but you focus more on the bad times.
Sure. Well, and that's part of it. It is an exciting place to be working.
Interesting.
Because these are all live questions. And we have some colleagues in the Netherlands who are doing what's called EMA, which is basically where you interrupt someone in their day at a random point and you say, how are you feeling right now? And you do that several times a day over 2 weeks. And even at that in the moment kind of analysis, there's a particular paper that was published recently by this group showing that actually they consider the dual-continuum model still does exist even when you're looking at it at that sort of in the moment. But perspective is a massive part of it. You're exactly right.
That's the word I was looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. And that clouds the measurement and the way that we measure. Because if we're asking you, everything we do is a self-report. So it's about your subjective experience. But if your perspective is clouded, that obviously has implications for our research.
I don't have too much to say about that, just that I guess it's an issue across studies that collate information based on self-reporting. But I guess there's nothing you can do to really...
Oh, I mean, there are lots of ways that, that there are better and worse approaches and methods and survey tools, which is another part of our work, is trying to improve that space. So going back to languishing, basically the big thing from our perspective is this group, which is the people who have low well-being but wouldn't be diagnosed with a mental illness. We always put this little ninja emoji there because it's basically this group, they exist. It's the secret people, except they're almost 20% of our large data set of Australian workplaces who fly under the radar. And we've done a bit of work recently to publish a bit of a characterization of what do we see as this languishing group. Who are they? Because I think once you look at the data, they really, to me, seem very familiar. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I'm sure we'd all know, or maybe are languishers, because it's about 20% of the population. And that 20% is across the world, you mean, right? Not just Australia.
Well, I mean, from our data, it's in Australia, but we see similar, different studies of different groups around the world have seen sort of similar proportions for sure. And so, like I say, this languishing group, why we care about them so much is because well-being is an important end in its own right. But we know that there are somewhere between 4 and 8 times more likely to develop a future mental illness, and that you can reduce that risk by improving their well-being. When we looked at, this languishing group of people, and again, this is based on a lot of Corey Keyes' work, the things that really stood out to us in general was this idea of social well-being. So we found that those who are languishing reported much lower levels of satisfaction with their social well-being, that they felt like they contributed to society, that they felt like they belonged, that they thought that society was a good place. These are huge differences.
Okay.
So my challenge to Quillette is, these are all social, these are all cultural issues. There's things that in public health and government and psychology can do to improve these, but it's a cultural phenomena, in my opinion, to see such big differences. The idea that, everyone, I think your parents would probably be the same age of my parents, and they say, in my day, we would play on the streets until the lights were on, the lights came on, and the whole neighborhood would be full of people. Neighborhoods are deserted now. Everyone's inside. These are huge, rapid shifts in the way that we kind of conduct ourselves.
Yeah, from what I hear about the past, there's been a big change in just the lifestyles that we have, especially for children, obviously. And Jonathan Haidt, who I know, and Jean Twenge, who I know we both really appreciate. They've done so much work on this, which Quillette has published, just how much the lives of children, which I don't think you haven't studied children, you've studied people.
This is adults, yeah.
But, those children, even my generation, I think I'm on the cusp, according to Jonathan Haidt. I was born in 95, so I grew up with this new world of, technology and social media, and not necessarily interacting so much with my community in person, but more with online communities halfway around the world. So yeah, without a doubt, technology has really changed our lifestyles, and I'm sure it's not just technology, but other things, I don't know.
Yeah, well, and that to me is still a big question mark. I think there's often this, I guess, bias of looking back and saying, oh, they were the happy times, like there was plenty of
bias.
Yeah, there's plenty of languishing and misery back then too. But I guess that's going back to the idea of this challenge of what are the cultural aspects that we can be, like, what are the levers that we can be pulling for the promotion of mental well-being? because it's not merely psychological, it's not merely physical, these kinds of ideas. And so I think this is where it becomes this stark difference between sort of languishers and flourishers, flourishers being people who have high levels of well-being.
So these are polar, these are on the same axis.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
So what we did, just to kind of make it a bit easier to interpret, is we said, what percentage of people, of the languishers versus the flourishers, said that they never feel this way? So we asked them this well-being measure, which is the mental health continuum short form by Corey Keyes. And we say, like, what percentage never feel this way or rarely? And so, like, you see, there's 3 that really stand out. And there's a huge swing basically between flourishing and languishing. But even the idea that 30% nearly, or somewhere between 20 and 30% of people who are languishing say that I never or rarely feel that society is a good place or becoming a better place.
Wow.
I mean, that is huge in my mind. And that's like directly in Quillette territory.
100%. And I think people would be familiar with the term black pill, which is this sort of idea in internet argot of just having a really dark opinion of the world and seeing the truth about the world. And the truth is that, you know, if you take this pill, like in the Matrix, whatever, you see the truth of the world. And the truth is that it's a dark, terrible place. So yeah, very topical.
Sure. So that's, you know, Quillette territory basically. Maybe it all is, maybe it's not, I don't know. But you go through the line and you go, like, the way that 20% or 23% saying that the way our society works makes sense to me, that they never feel that that's the case. That I felt something, that I had something important to contribute to society.
I belong to a community, like a social group. Yeah.
And that's where this idea of languishing, she said, like, why should I care about languishing? Because it's a form of suffering in its own right, basically, you know? So people who, and then you go down the line, like people who say, my life has a sense of direction or meaning to it, 11% say they never feel that that's the case. That's suffering, you know? Think that I'm a part of a society that is not good, that doesn't make sense to me. I have nothing to contribute. I have no purpose. I don't feel confident to express my ideas or opinions. This is a big issue. And I think, yeah, again, Quillette has targeted some of these things directly, which is why it's such a pleasure to be having this conversation. But it's a big issue, and we really wanted to really put the spotlight on it.
Yeah, because the reality is that people who have a good opinion about where they stand in the world or about the world in general, like, I don't want to say that the languishers are abusers or things like that, but when you look at, I know it's an extreme example, but the manifestos of some recent, attacks in America and things like that, you look at these manifestos and you read that these, you know, line for line are pretty much what people say often, like, the world is a terrible place. I add nothing to this world. So yeah, I don't want to say that languishers criminals or anything like that, but that a lot of these sentiments.
Sure. Yeah, look, definitely not. And I think it's important to be able to recognize, if we think about that dual-continuum model, and this is the, you know, being low on the vertical axis, you can feel these things with a mental illness too, right? So let's not, I think you said that really well. But the idea that these are groups of people who are feeling this way, who are part of society, like most of our data was collected. This is about 16,000 Australians.
Wow.
Were collected in workplaces for the large majority, or at universities.
Like, what type of workplaces? Were they professional people? Were they
very
blue-collar?
very broad,
Okay.
but probably primarily sort of working professionals.
Okay. Is there an argument that maybe, I don't know, at least in my head, I've got an idea that often more intelligent people or intellectual people can suffer more mentally?
I don't know. I think we're not really in a place to say that kind of thing. What we're just trying to do is saying that this is the sort of the where sort of study. The why are we here is the question. That's the challenge. That's the challenge I'm giving Quillette, basically, because it's too hard to answer from a research perspective. But I think it's a huge question that we need to be asking.
And it would be interesting to have studies about languishing, you know, decade on decade, to see, the cultural, and sort of map it to cultural shifts. But it sounds like it's a really new burgeoning sort of area, maybe started with Adam Grant in 2021. Do we have
Yeah, it started probably 20 years before that with
Okay.
Corey Keyes, but it
Oh, yeah.
definitely took a huge step into the limelight,
Yeah.
I think, with Adam Grant's work. That just made it, and also I think like other academics, I've heard them talk about, the pandemic as the well-being experiment that nobody asked for, because, automatically,
Silver lining of it.
well, in a sense, but I think, yeah, so many people recognize what it felt like to have low levels of well-being and how difficult that experience is, not necessarily to be diagnosed with a mental illness, but to have low levels of well-being. When you think about things like a sense of autonomy disappeared
Yeah.
basically overnight.
Mhm.
And so in that sense, the focus and the attention on well-being has grown sort of since then. Well, the next question is really about what do we do about well-being?
Mhm.
So the other side of our work is really thinking about how do we promote mental well-being?
Mhm.
Okay, so languishing is this issue. What are we going to do about it? Obviously, there will be cultural drivers, there'll be economic drivers, there'll be lots of different sort of environmental conditions that are contributing to languishing that we see, but there'll be psychological ones too.
Mhm.
And so that's where we focus. So we're very clearly not suggesting that we have all the answers, but we take a really pragmatic approach because, if things like personal circumstances and individuals' finances are driving languishing, which they likely are, we as a small team are not going to do much about poverty right now.
Yeah.
I'd love to see it.
Or interest rates or inflation.
Well,
or
exactly. That's
yeah.
all very much out of our hands. So we take a pretty practical approach, an applied approach, which is trying to translate the psychological evidence on how do we build mental well-being with psychological skills, and then translate that into programs that can be disseminated into the community. And so what we've done is a lot of reviewing, a lot of systematic
Mhm.
reviewing, which I don't know if you're familiar with that
A little
term.
bit, yeah.
It's not the most fun job in the world.
Just reading through reviews, right, and sort of
Yeah, it's
finding.
about, yeah, exactly. So particularly what we've done is a meta-analysis, which
Mhm.
is published in one of the Nature journals, Nature Human Behavior, which we basically had to read 20,000 papers
Wow.
between a small team of us over a couple of years to get to the bottom of, what has been done in this space. If you think about research papers often are conflicting or they have slightly different results for different populations, a meta-analysis pulls all that data together and makes it like one mega study.
Yeah.
And really what we were interested in this study is how have psychological interventions, or what types of psychological interventions have been used to improve well-being, and are they effective?
Fascinating.
And what we wanted to find was not only are they effective in the general population, what about in those with a mental or physical illness? And so here are the results. This is the main takeaway. It's a bit depressing that like 3 years of work fits into one slide so neatly, but that's okay. Really what we see here, I don't know if you want to go into all the detail, but all these different types of interventions that we found that have been tried around the world. So things like acceptance and commitment therapy, compassion-based interventions, cognitive-based interventions, expressive writing, mindfulness, positive psychological interventions, and reminiscence interventions. That's what we came across. Basically what we see here is these are 3 results for the general population, mentally ill population, and physically ill population. And basically when this is called a forest plot, when any of these dots and the error bars touch this line here, that means there was no effect.
Okay.
The further we see it away means we see greater effect. And basically the size of the circle indicates how many people it had been tested on. So the
Okay.
larger the circle means we've seen it tested in more people. So we're kind of more confident of the result.
Okay. Ah.
Compared to the smaller dots where it's not been tested, that commonly. And I think the biggest thing that we saw here, and basically what, because with psychological research, there are biases, you want to be on the safer side and you want to be quite conservative with what you suggest. So long story short, in addition to the 0 means we saw no change in well-being in these interventions. But when it gets to point 2, that's where we would say like, we're now confident that we're seeing a result. So anything that didn't get past point 2, we're just saying like, there was an effect, but
In the minus, that means it had a bad
a
effect?
negative effect. Yeah,
Wow.
exactly. Yeah, because a lot of these things, there can be harm that comes from these things, right?
Yeah, and, that's an argument that's thrown around a bit. I've noticed at least, of a sort of anti-therapy movement that we've become too obsessed with therapy and interventions, and that therapy can do more harm than good. So it looks like maybe some interventions, can do that actually.
Yeah, we didn't see a whole lot of that. We saw that it was mostly
Mostly positive.
positive, but this is again at the average
Yeah.
level too. So that's not to say that individuals, we wouldn't capture that here. So definitely can't discount that kind of thing. But the big takeaway here is this idea of where we saw cognitive-based therapy having an effect, because CBT is very, very common in Australia.
Very popular.
In the general population, we basically saw that it doesn't have an effect for improving well-being.
Okay.
And that's not to talk about mental illnesses, talk about the outcome of well-being. But in mentally ill populations, it did have an effect. So we have a lot of trials of preventative CBT interventions. And I guess what this would suggest is that's probably not where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck, because we know for the outcome of well-being, not for the prevention of mental illness, I guess that's technically a different thing. This might not be where we'd want to focus.
And just to be clear, languishers are in this general population.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that would exactly.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. The idea, this is really about where they're recruited from.
Yeah.
So was this conducted in a group of people who are using services, whether physical or mental?
Okay, so I thought CBT was amazing because that's what you hear, but
yeah, it can work. And this is, really, it wasn't designed to improve well-being. It's about, addressing symptoms of mental illness primarily. But the big takeaway here, I guess, is that there's a different pattern of results that you see. And the idea where we'd like the field to go is to be more precise about what it is we recommend for different groups of people, because we see that not everything is equally effective depending on who you are.
So you'd like to see more tailored approaches.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly right. And so that's tailored is exactly the word, because that's the work that we've been trying to do, is to design a wellbeing intervention that we've tested a few times now, where we sort of use the analogy of the gym. So if you walk into the gym, I think you go to the gym, right?
I'm a big fan.
You're a big fan, yeah. It's been a couple of years for me, but I should get back into it. When you walk into a gym, there's heaps of exercises that you could do. No one tries them all, right? And ideally what you would have is a trainer who comes and says, what do you want to work on?
Exactly.
What do you enjoy? And then we'll tailor a strategy for you.
Yeah.
And so what we're trying to do is bring that level of precision and tailoring to a psychological intervention. So we do it in a group. It's not one-on-one, but the idea is that from this systematic reviewing that we've done, we've got a lot of activities that you could be doing. So it's kind of like the gym, but over 5 weeks, it's about figuring out what would you enjoy? How would this work for you? And can we turn these into real habits? And particularly for mental health, this is very new for people. So no one's really tried to make a habit out of something like a mindfulness activity. That's not, mindfulness is getting more common, but to try and turn this into a habit and a routine, people don't know what they don't know. So that's why it's quite intentional that over time, we come back and we reflect what went wrong. People get really excited and they say, I'm going to wake up at 6 a.m. and do yoga every day. Yeah, all that kind of stuff. And then you come back next week and go, actually, my kids wake up halfway through and that doesn't work for me. So then it's about learning and just kind of trial and error. And what we're trying to do is give you that empowerment to say, I know what's effective on average, from the research that we present. Here are the, they can be trusted interventions.
Yeah.
This isn't the tissue boxes and yogurts and stuff.
Yeah.
But most importantly is, how do I make it work for me?
One of my questions, I suppose, is how do you get these languishers to know that they are languishing? Where do you even, what would the future look like for you, an ideal future? Because do languishers even know?
That's again like a good question. That's what I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think because it is its own form of suffering, I think that they would feel, if you ask them, and that's kind of the other part, is that we often just don't ask these things. But for example, the feeling of blah, people really resonated with that feeling.
Yeah.
Actually, that's how I feel. I feel stagnant and empty. So they know it, but it's maybe not like it's very easily, almost like you can distract yourself from it because it's not as intense, say, as the symptoms of an illness.
It's not acute. It's not like, oh my God, I need to fix this right now.
They're droning in the background almost, I guess, is what you might describe it as. And so Corey Keyes has described it in the past as kind of like ghosting through life. the cover of his book is actually really interesting. It's and it's called Languishing. I recommend it. It's got like, that melting face emoji.
Yeah.
It's
I
kind of
love that
smiling,
emoji.
but it's melting.
I use it a lot.
Do you really?
Hard to describe, like if I had to describe to my boomer parents, for example, what that emoji meant or represented, it's sort of hard.
Yeah, well, I mean, and
Like,
this sounds quite bad on me,
yeah.
but when I showed my wife that, she was like, so we've got 3 kids at home, and so that comes with its own challenges. And she said, like, that emoji is the one me and my mum friends send to each other.
Right. Wow. Most
like-
used.
Because it does speak to this thing of like, I am satisfied with life, but man, it's getting a bit
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Struggle. Yeah.
she's doing well, but gets sent around a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, to your question, I guess in an ideal future, we would want ways for languishing to be detected, particularly from an assessment perspective. So at the moment, for example, if you were to go to a GP, there's a diagnostic criteria that would say, are you feeling these? It's obviously not as simple as this, but are you exhibiting these symptoms? Languishers probably aren't exhibiting those symptoms. So we'd like to sort of extend some of the questions that we're asking so that we can identify this languishing group of people and then have options for them.
Yeah. And I can imagine that just talking about it more and getting it out in the zeitgeist, having that word there, it sort of increases the brand awareness, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
And people go, okay, that's me. Or governments start to, or workplaces, institutions start to just focus on it a bit more.
To be honest with you, like that brand awareness language is so appropriate, because what we've been up to as Be Wellco, we started here at SAHMRI, and we spun out as a company basically because winning research funding in this area is really difficult. So we've taken a different approach, which is trying to win our own, like deliver services basically that we can then use that income to subsidize our research.
Interesting.
And we've been merged recently and acquired, and part of that acquisition has come with some marketers, and they basically said this is a brand awareness problem.
Yeah.
Because we've traditionally focused on flourishing and how good it is to feel well. And from a marketing perspective, I mean, you can tell me, but I think it gets perceived as this nice to have, whereas flipping the script and saying actually languishing, the absence of flourishing, is a massive problem, and we think about it, that gets people a little bit more engaged.
Yeah, definitely. I think because perhaps we're so swamped with marketing that's like, as you were saying, like tissue boxes, you get like feel good, feel great, blah, blah. We're just so used to seeing that all the time, and we're less conscious of the detriments of not flourishing.
Exactly.
And I think a lot of people probably think, do I deserve to feel better? Do I deserve flourishing? Like I'm okay, my life's fine, I've got a job, I've got whatever, I'm not mentally ill, I'm not depressed, I'm not homeless. Why I don't feel great, but what's the point of?
Yeah, there's a researcher who's saying it's Motion Joshinlu. He lives in South Korea, and he has written a lot about this idea of fear of happiness.
Wow.
This is exactly what you're talking about. And the cultural differences are huge.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
It's another question I wanted to ask too, a little bit about sex differences, whether you found that there are more female languishers or male. Or...
Yeah, that's actually interesting. We saw that that's quite flat, to be honest, across gender, where we saw differences in age.
Okay.
And it's actually an international occurrence that there's this traditional U-shaped curve of happiness, they call it. I don't know if we're familiar with that. The idea that
it makes sense.
Yeah, you're kind of happy, younger, then you're sort of like 40, 50, and that starts to dip, 60, midlife.
Yeah.
And then as you get older, you get happier again. What they're seeing around the world is that U-shape is no longer U-shaped because the youth aren't happy anymore. So it is looking a little bit more sort of diagonal. We saw the same thing in our results, but it was particularly the sort of the 25 to 35-year-olds. Obviously, we don't do that much we do nothing under 18, but in 18 to 25, we don't see that often in our work. But that kind of 25 to 35-year-old area, it's almost like the U shape has, the bottom of the U has dropped to a younger age, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think that I can imagine someone sort of emerging from that age category, sort of. I can see why it's difficult, particularly when you think about the world as a good place. That people are feeling, I mean, you tell me again, this is a Quillette issue, but how is the world looking to a 25 or 30-year-old who think, I can never buy a house? The job market's looking precarious. The financial world's looking precarious culturally,
Yeah. Well, we're also swamped with information, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with Martin Boudry. He's a Belgian philosopher who writes a bit for Quillette. And he wrote a fascinating piece called The 7 Laws of Pessimism. It was one of our top articles of 2024. I've also got a YouTube video about it if you want to watch. But it pretty much goes through 7 sort of modern practices or things we do that create this pessimism that is so prevalent in the West. And I distinctly remember one of the laws was that we are just constantly swamped in information because it's a 24-hour news cycle. We have it everywhere we go, on our phones, on TV. And it's like, wow, there's been a bombing in Uganda. I live in Sydney, but that sucks. And that's just depleted me a little bit. And it's just this constant, the way I think about it, it's definitely not, I don't know if it's scientific or whatever, but you have like a glass full at the start of your day, or at least a lot of people feel like they do. And just water constantly gets spilled, every little negative thing. And I think there's just more and more, it feels like the world's gone to shit, for lack of a better word, because we're seeing it every day on Instagram, TikTok.
Yeah. And again, I think it's an open question of how there are perspective issues there, in the sense of how much negative information should you know about, in a sense. But at the same time, that's not made up stuff.
Yeah.
Right. So
it's real. Yeah.
The housing, if you just say, all right, let's close the box on just Australia now and say, is it really difficult for a young Australian to buy a home? Yes, it is. So objectively, it is harder. So you don't want to make it sound, not that you did this, but to make it sound like this is just in your head. You've got a pessimistic outlook on life. That would be true to a degree, but also there are real challenges.
Yeah. If you feel like you are languishing, or that someone you love is languishing, what can they do in the short term?
If you are languishing, there's this great report that actually myself and Fran Achter and my colleague and Laura Lowe wrote on behalf of Beyond Blue, which is literally there to answer this question. And it's called A Guide to What Works for Mental Wellbeing. And again, this is a much more user-friendly version of the systematic reviewing that we've done, which has a thumbs up, thumbs down rating. And it's out there by the Beyond Blue for this exact reason. It's a guide to what works.
I'll link it.
Yeah, thank you. And so there are basically 8 things that have 3 thumbs up, which mean that we're really confident that these are effective for languishing and improving well-being. Often they don't cost very much and are readily available. So that's where we would look.
Okay. Could we go through them briefly?
Sure. Yeah. So the things that we came up with, that we found had 3 thumbs up.
Most effective
were things like social prescribing interventions. So getting out there and being, social. Art interventions.
Interesting.
Acceptance and commitment therapy. CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, which we've spoken about, primarily in clinical populations, that one. Mindfulness-based interventions, positive psychology interventions, reminiscence interventions, and physical activity.
Okay. So yeah, definitely the first one and the last one, which I personally use a lot when I'm feeling a bit crap or even having a bad day. I found that just having a good conversation with someone just takes my mind off that. And yeah, physical activity. Art intervention is interesting. What does that often look like?
I think it's about being more intentionally creative, so I guess it's again one of those things that creativity, it's, because we're kind of a bit utilitarian. We're sort of like, what does this thing do to me? Creativity can sort of fall by the wayside a little bit because it's not like going to get you your next promotion, or it's not going to find you a job or improve your credit rating or something like that. But it is valuable. And so just taking that time to do something creative, and I don't think it matters obviously what that looks like, what medium you're using, can be really valuable.
Nice.
Yeah, yeah. There's one interesting thing that we do with people, and it's so fun that we've turned it into a whole campaign across the state of Tasmania.
Wow.
We call it meaningful pictures. And so the idea is that when you ask someone like, what drives your well-being or what gives you a sense of meaning, that's a very difficult question to answer. And often people have like a blurry idea, but they've never really thought about it or never been asked it. And so what we say is pull out your phone, go through your camera roll, and just in like the last 20 pictures, find something that's a resource to your mental health. Because we know with the negativity bias that we do notice threats and challenges more often than not. This is a nice way to kind of balance out, the negativity with some of your resources. And what's really interesting is that there are often creative things or hobbies or time spent with others, like all the things that you see here. But what I find really interesting is people often say, I treat these things like they're luxuries. These are things that like in a stressful moment, they're the first thing to go. And by doing some of these reflection exercises, you start to realize that actually this is for my health. It's actually more of a must-have than a nice to have, which I think is a really nice reflection. And so more of that in the community would be fantastic.
Great. Yeah, I hope we have a future in which there are more flourishers than languishers. If people want to learn more about your work or the Be Well Co, what should they do?
Yeah, check out our website, newly designed website as part of this new merging.
Cool.
So it looks pretty cool. bewellco.io. Otherwise, you can find me on like LinkedIn mostly. And I have
podcast?
I have my own podcast, which is called Researching Happy.
Highly recommend it.
Yeah, thank you.
Very interesting.
Which is me talking with other academics about this stuff.
Yeah.
So lots of the issues in the field and what we can do about it.
Great. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Matt.